he's jobless.
We were at a networking gala for senior executives, the kind where champagne costs more than most people's rent and everyone speaks in revenue figures. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, a ballroom full of people proving they belonged. I stood near the bar in a simple black suit, neck tattoos visible above my collar, nursing whiskey while others traded business cards like currency. I don't network loudly. I never have. That made me visible in the wrong way. Success has a uniform in the corporate world. Designer suits, polished shoes, the right watch, the right words. People perform their worth like theater. That night I wasn't dressed for the part. The man who noticed me had been holding court for the past hour. Louis George, senior executive, designer, everything. Voice that carried across rooms. He'd been talking about growth strategies, leadership philosophy, the empire he helped build, his empire, his company. Someone near him glanced my way, curious about the outsider with ink on his skin who wasn't performing. Louis followed their gaze. "What do you do?" Someone asked me, polite but uncertain. Before I could answer, Louis laughed, sharp, dismissive. "He's between opportunities," he said, gesturing with his champagne glass. "Some people wander. Not everyone's built for the corporate ladder." A few people chuckled nervously. Others looked at their shoes. One woman's smile froze. I didn't correct him. "Wait. Before I tell you what happens next, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what Louis is about to discover in the next 60 seconds will change how you think about power forever. The people who stay until the end? They're the ones who understand that real authority doesn't announce itself. If you've ever been underestimated, judged by your appearance, or dismissed by someone who thought they were above you, this story is for you. Subscribe. You'll want to see the look on his face. And tell me where you're watching from at the comment section. I want to know where my story family is. Now, let's dive in. Building a company from nothing teaches you that ego is expensive. Real power doesn't need to defend itself against assumptions. Silence, when used strategically, reveals more than it conceals. Let them underestimate you. Let them think the tattoos mean something they don't. I nodded once and took a sip of my whiskey. What Louis didn't know was that I hadn't worked for anyone in years. Not because I couldn't find work, but because I'd built something that didn't require me to prove it existed. Hans Group started in a cramped apartment with borrowed capital and a vision no one believed in. Quiet discipline. Strategic anonymity. No press releases, no ego-driven interviews. The same focus that helped me survive building a business in silence helped me build an empire no one saw coming. That company he was so proud of, the one he kept calling his company. Every paycheck he'd ever received had my signature on it, not in ink but in ownership structure. Control doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it watches, sometimes it waits. Louis was still talking, louder now, emboldened by my silence. He mentioned upcoming board decisions, expansion plans, leadership changes at his level. Across the room, the MC tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." The evening's formal program was about to begin. The room always knows who it thinks you are before you open your mouth. It decides by the cut of your suit, the watch at your wrist, the confidence with which you shake a hand and hold eye contact for exactly the right number of seconds. In corporate spaces, worth is rarely discovered. It is performed. Success walks in ahead of the person, announcing itself through fabric, posture, and vocabulary, and everyone plays along because everyone is afraid of being miscast. At these gatherings, achievement has a uniform. Dark jackets, careful shoes, practiced smiles. Titles become introductions, compressed into neat verbal badges that explain why someone deserves attention. Senior, lead, director, founder. Each word functions like a currency, exchanged quickly before the conversation moves on. No one asks what the work feels like at 2 in the morning, or what was lost to earn that promotion. The questions circle safer ground. Where do you work? Who do you know? What are you building? The answers are polished because the setting demands it. The handshake is its own ritual. Too firm suggests insecurity. Too soft invites dismissal. The eyes must meet, but not linger. Even the laugh has rules. Brief, controlled, timed to show agreement rather than joy. It is theater in the truest sense. Everyone knows their lines, everyone knows the cues, and improvisation is risky unless you already have status to protect you. The strange part is how quickly people forget they are acting. After enough rehearsals, the role begins to feel like a self. Some arrive early and position themselves carefully, scanning name tags, tracking influence the way gamblers track odds. Others circulate endlessly, never staying long enough to be known, only recognized. There are those who speak loudly and often, filling space as if silence might expose them. There are those who nod with measured restraint, saving their words like investments. All of them are performing credibility, hoping it will be mistaken for substance. What rarely makes it onto the stage is uncertainty. Doubt is backstage, hidden with the coats and bags. Fear, too, is kept out of sight. The fear of being irrelevant, of peaking too early or too late, of being found out. Corporate culture teaches people to translate insecurity into ambition, exhaustion into dedication. Long hours become proof of loyalty. Busyness becomes a moral stance. Rest is framed as weakness unless it can be rebranded as strategy. The fixation on visible markers creates a strange distortion. The person who speaks best appears to think best. The person who dresses well appears more capable. The person with the louder title appears more valuable. Meanwhile, the quiet observer, the one who listens more than they speak, often fades into the background despite carrying insight that could change the direction of a room. In this setting, restraint reads as absence. Depth moves too slowly for applause. There is also comfort in the script. The performance spares people from asking harder questions about purpose or satisfaction. It is easier to chase the next promotion than to examine whether the latter is leaning against the wrong wall. The applause of peers can drown out private misgivings, at least for a while. When success is defined by external signals, it becomes measurable, comparable, and endlessly expandable. There is always a higher title, a larger office, a more impressive introduction. Yet, beneath the polished exchanges, small fractures appear. A pause before answering a question about fulfillment. A forced smile when someone else announces a win. A momentary drop in posture when the conversation turns away. These are the unscripted moments, the brief glimpses of the person behind the role. They pass quickly, corrected almost immediately, because the show must go on. The cost of constant performance is subtle but cumulative. When worth is always on display, identity becomes conditional. People begin to confuse recognition with value, applause with meaning. The suit starts to feel heavier. The title, once thrilling, becomes a shield that must be defended. Any threat to it feels personal even when it is merely professional. Conflict escalates because it is no longer about ideas or outcomes, but about maintaining the image that has been so carefully built. What makes this theater persuasive is that it works, at least on the surface. Deals are made, careers advance, networks expand. The system rewards those who learn the choreography, but it also filters out other kinds of excellence. Patience, moral courage, long-term thinking. Qualities that do not photograph well or fit neatly onto a badge. Over time, the stage grows crowded with performers who look successful and thin on people who are doing work that lasts. Every culture tells a story about what it values. Corporate culture tells its story through symbols that can be seen, counted, and ranked. The danger is not that these symbols exist, but that they become substitutes for substance. When that happens, the performance stops pointing toward achievement and starts replacing it. The theater becomes the destination rather than the means. And still, night after night, the lights come on, the doors open, and the actors take their places. Some believe fully in their roles. Some play them with irony. A few watch carefully, aware of the script, but not owned by it. Those few understand something the room rarely says aloud, that real success is quieter, slower, and far less interested in applause. It does not announce itself with a title or a tailored jacket. It simply shows up in the work, long after the curtain has fallen. Young Han arrived without announcing himself, which already set him apart in a room built on announcements. The gala pulsed with introductions, firm handshakes, and voices carefully tuned to sound confident without tipping into desperation. Names were exchanged like business cards were currency, each one carrying a silent footnote: title, rank, perceived worth. Youngie moved through this noise quietly, as though he had stepped into a play midway through the second act and saw no reason to interrupt. He wore a black suit that fit well but refused to shout about it. No glossy cufflinks. No watch designed to catch the light at precisely the right angle. The suit did its job and stopped there. A faint glimpse of ink rose from the collar at his neck. Not aggressive, not hidden either. Simply present. An earring caught a soft reflection from the chandelier overhead, enough to be noticed by those who scanned for differences. In a room trained to reward sameness disguised as polish, small deviations carried weight. He accepted a glass of whiskey from a passing server and took a slow sip, not because he needed the drink, but because holding something gave his hands a reason to stay still. He stood near the edge of the room, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid becoming part of any orbit. Around him, conversations formed and dissolved in predictable patterns. Short laughter, strategic nods, exaggerated interest that faded the moment a more useful person entered the circle. Youngie watched without judgment. That was the strange part. He did not sneer or smirk. He did not look bored. His expression held a calm attentiveness, the kind that unsettled people who were used to being mirrored. He seemed to listen to the room itself rather than any single voice, tracking the rhythm of ambition as it rose and fell with each exchange. Most attendees mistook his stillness for absence. To them, he registered as a background figure, someone's +1 perhaps, or a junior staffer who had wandered too far from the intern cluster. The tattoos invited quick conclusions. The lack of visible networking sealed them. In a space where effort was mistaken for value, restraint read as irrelevance. Youngie did not correct this assumption. He had learned long ago that rooms like this revealed more when you let them speak first. People performed differently when they believed no one important was watching. Their jokes grew sharper. Their truths slipped out sideways. Confidence, when unobserved, tended to loosen into arrogance. A group nearby erupted into loud laughter at a story about a failed startup. The kind of laughter that confirmed everyone present was safely on the winning side of history. Youngie glanced over, his eyes steady, and returned to his drink. He had been on the other side before, not as a punchline, but as a quiet witness to how quickly admiration turned when momentum slowed. The memory did not sting. It informed. What separated him from the rest of the room was not mystery or secrecy, but patience. While others rushed to establish relevance, he seemed content letting relevance arrive on its own schedule. There was no visible hunger in him, no need to be validated by proximity to power. That absence unsettled people who thrived on mutual reassurance. Hunger was the common language here. Youngie spoke something else entirely. A few attendees noticed him in passing, their eyes lingering just long enough to flag him as unfamiliar. Some frowned slightly, trying to place him. Others dismissed him just as quickly, attention snapping back to safer mirrors. He did not belong to any obvious category, and rooms like this preferred their guests easily labeled. He shifted his weight, listening as a man nearby recited his achievements with the cadence of someone who had practiced them often. The words landed heavily, as if meant to pin the room into agreement. Youngi's gaze drifted to the man's hands, tight around his glass, knuckles pale. Performance, he thought, always costs something. When Youngi finally spoke, it was only to the bartender. A quiet thank you, a nod. His voice was low, unhurried, carrying none of the upward inflection that asked for approval. Even that brief exchange carried a sense of balance, as though he had no need to prove himself to anyone standing between the ice and the bottle. The irony of the night was simple. The room was filled with people desperate to be seen, and the one person who truly understood the machinery behind their desperation had chosen not to step into the spotlight. He was not hiding. He was waiting. There is a difference, though few recognize it. Youngi Han remained where he was, an outsider by choice rather than circumstance. He understood that power rarely announced itself with noise. It watched. It listened. It let others mistake silence for insignificance. And in a room obsessed with appearances, that misunderstanding was not a weakness. It was leverage. As the gala continued, the volume rose, confidence swelling with each refilled glass. Youngi stayed exactly where he was, unremarkable by design, steady as the floor beneath the polished shoes. The room believed it had already measured him. That belief would soon become its most expensive mistake. Louis George did not simply enter rooms. He announced himself to them. His presence had a rhythm, measured steps, squared shoulders, a voice trained to carry just far enough that people nearby would hear without feeling shouted at. He was the kind of man who believed a room owed him attention once he arrived, because attention, in his mind, was the currency he had earned through years of relentless ascent. His story was one he loved to tell, especially when the setting allowed it to sound heroic. He had started low enough to make the climb respectable and ended high enough to make it intimidating. Long hours, missed birthdays, sacrificed weekends. These were not costs to him, but proof. Each promotion became a rung on a ladder he worshipped, and every rung reinforced a simple conviction. Worth is earned, and employment is the receipt. Louis had learned early how to perform success. He mastered the handshake that lingered just long enough to assert dominance. He perfected the smile that suggested generosity while measuring status. Even his laughter felt curated, brief, controlled, never too loud. To Louis, corporate life was not a system but a stage, and he had trained himself to stand in the spotlight without flinching. Failure, in his view, was not complex. It was lazy. Temporary unemployment was not circumstance but character. He spoke about grit and hunger as if they were measurable units, convinced that anyone without visible success simply had not wanted it badly enough. Nuance bored him. Context irritated him. The world, to Louis, made sense only when reduced to winners and those who had failed to become them. He loved networking events for the same reason some people loved mirrors. They reflected back the image he had spent years constructing. At gatherings like this, he could speak in polished phrases about growth and leadership while subtly ranking everyone around him. He listened just long enough to locate a title, a company name, a position on the invisible hierarchy he carried in his head. Once placed, a person either mattered or faded into background noise. Louis believed humility was overrated, often confused with weakness. He preferred certainty. Certainty was efficient. It saved time. It kept conversations clean and hierarchical. When he spoke about his career, there was always an unspoken lesson attached. This is how it's done, and this is what it costs. If others felt small in comparison, that was not cruelty. That was motivation, at least as he saw it. Alcohol loosened his restraint but sharpened his instincts. With a drink in hand, Lewis became bolder, more theatrical. He liked to hold court, leaning slightly forward, drawing listeners in. His stories grew sharper edges. His judgments became more direct. He enjoyed the subtle power shift when people laughed at the right moments, nodded at the right phrases. It confirmed his place above the crowd. What Lewis never questioned was the foundation beneath his confidence. He had built his identity so tightly around his role that removing the title would have felt like erasure. Work was not something he did. It was who he was. The idea that someone might exist outside that framework, might choose silence over performance, observation over dominance, felt threatening in a way he could not name. So when his gaze landed on someone who did not play the game, irritation followed curiosity. A man who did not advertise his worth disrupted the order Lewis depended on. It suggested cracks in a system Lewis needed to believe was absolute. He mistook restraint for lack, quiet for absence, simplicity for failure. The conclusion came easily, comfortably, because it aligned with everything he had spent years telling himself. Lewis stepped forward, not out of malice, but out of certainty. He believed he was right, and belief, when hardened, can be more dangerous than intent. In his mind, calling someone out was not rude. It was corrective. It was the natural duty of someone who had made it to remind others of where they stood. He cleared his throat, straightened his jacket, and prepared to speak, not just to one man, but to the room itself. This was his element, a gathered audience, a moment waiting to be claimed. Louis George took the stage the way he always did, unaware that some stages are not built to support the weight of unchecked pride, and some performances mark the beginning of a fall rather than another ascent. The moment didn't arrive with drama. It slipped in quietly, the way discomfort often does, wearing a smile, carrying a drink, pretending to be harmless. Youngie was standing near the edge of the room, glass in hand, posture loose, eyes steady. He had chosen that spot on purpose, not to hide, but to watch. Rooms like this told their stories loudly if you stayed silent long enough. Lewis noticed him the way predators notice stillness. Louis George was in full form that night. He wore confidence like a tailored jacket, sharp, loud, expensive. People gathered around him without thinking about it. He laughed often, touched shoulders, spoke with the easy authority of someone used to being listened to. His stories landed cleanly because they were polished, rehearsed, and designed to remind everyone where he stood. Above them. When his gaze landed on Youngie, it paused. Not curiosity, calculation, a brief scan. Black suit, plain cut, no visible company logo, no name-dropping posture. Neck tattoos peeking through like an unfinished sentence. An earring catching light where it wasn't expected. Lewis smiled. He shifted his body just enough to turn the crowd with him, glass lifted slightly, voice raised to carry without shouting. "Now this," he said lightly, "is interesting." Eyes followed his line of sight. The circle widened. Youngie felt it before he saw it. The subtle tightening of the air, the way conversations stalled mid-breath. Lewis took a step closer, close enough to feel personal, far enough to perform. "Let me guess," he said, tilting his head as if solving a puzzle. "Between jobs, or just floating these days?" The words landed soft but sharp, like velvet over steel. A few people laughed, not because it was funny, but because silence would have felt dangerous. Someone coughed. Someone else took a sip too quickly. The sound rippled outward, thin and uneven, then died. Youngie didn't move. Lewis continued, encouraged by the sound. "I mean, No badge, no pitch, no urgency, he added, glancing around for approval. Must be nice. Some of us actually have responsibilities. More laughter this time, louder, a safer distance from the truth. Youngie looked at Lewis then. Not with anger, not with shame. Just a calm, direct look that asked nothing and offered nothing. It unsettled a few people, not Lewis, not yet. Lewis mistook the silence for defeat. He leaned back slightly, arms opening, the picture of generosity. Don't get me wrong, he said. Everyone's welcome here, even observers. Observers? The word hung there, dressed up as kindness, stripped down to insult. Youngie said nothing. That was the mistake Lewis didn't see coming. Because silence, when chosen, does something strange to a room. It removes the rhythm bullies rely on. There was no pushback to overpower, no embarrassment to feed on. The moment stretched. People shifted their weight. A woman near the bar frowned without realizing it. A man 2 steps behind Lewis glanced away. Lewis filled the space again, forced now. You should try networking, he added, voice just a shade tighter. Might help. Youngie nodded once, slow, almost thoughtful. Still nothing. The crowd waited for something, an apology, a joke, a collapse. None came. The absence became loud. The laughter didn't return this time. Lewis felt it slipping, the way control always does when it's built on performance. He chuckled, sharp and quick, trying to close the moment. Anyway, he said, turning slightly. Good luck out there. But the damage was already done. Not to Youngie, to Lewis. Because public humiliation isn't always about who's targeted. Sometimes it's about who reveals themselves. Lewis had wanted to show dominance. What he showed instead was fear. Fear of the unlabeled, the unplaced, the man who didn't play along. Youngie watched him turn back to his admirers, posture reassembled, voice rising again as if nothing had happened. The crowd followed, grateful for the release. Conversations restarted. The room exhaled. Youngie stayed where he was. A man approached him a few minutes later, quiet, careful. You okay? He asked, not meeting Youngie's eyes. Youngie smiled faintly. I'm fine. And he was. Because some humiliations don't bruise. They clarify. They strip away illusion and leave the structure exposed. Youngie hadn't lost standing. He had never entered the game. Across the room, Lewis laughed too loudly at his own joke, already chasing the next moment, unaware that something irreversible had shifted. Power, once questioned, even silently, never sits the same way again. Youngie finished his drink, set the glass down, and waited. Silence had always been Youngie's most fluent language. In a world that measured worth by how loudly one could speak, he had learned early that the quietest person in the room often carried the most weight. He didn't react because he didn't need to. Words were currency he spent sparingly, and when he did, they landed with precision. Those who mistook his restraint for indifference simply didn't understand that silence was not absence, it was control. There was a time, long before Han's group became synonymous with success, when Youngie's silence came from necessity rather than choice. He had grown up in a cramped apartment where walls were thin and tempers even thinner. His father, a man who spoke more with fists than reason, had taught him that noise rarely brought peace. His mother, on the other hand, carried quiet like a shield, enduring life's blows with a grace that never cracked. From her, Youngie learned that silence was not weakness, it was survival. When he started Han's group, he did so without fanfare or family name to lean on. There were no powerful allies waiting to open doors, only a relentless will and an instinct to listen more than he spoke. In those early years, while competitors boasted of visions and grand plans, Youngie kept his head down and worked. He learned the language of markets, the rhythm of people, and the value of saying less. Silence, he discovered, had a gravity to it. It drew truth out of others. In meetings, he would sit and observe, speaking only after everyone else had emptied themselves of words. By then, he always knew exactly what needed to be said, and often it was only a few sentences that tilted the room in his favor. He was never seduced by extravagance. His office was simple, almost austere: wood, paper, light. No unnecessary decoration, no trophies of wealth. Those who entered expecting opulence often left unsettled. There was nothing to distract them from the man himself, nothing to project but their own discomfort. Youngie preferred it that way. He had seen too many powerful men lose themselves in the noise of success, mistaking attention for authority. To him, real power was invisible, felt rather than displayed. It did not need to announce itself, nor did it defend itself against ignorance. The world would always talk. He had learned to let it. That philosophy had shaped not only his business, but his entire way of being. When rivals accused him of arrogance, he remained unmoved. When journalists wrote speculative pieces about his motives, he didn't respond. His board sometimes urged him to release statements, to control the narrative, but Youngie simply said, "The truth doesn't need a press release." Over time, even his critics began to understand that silence, in his case, wasn't evasion. It was judgment. He gave people the space to reveal themselves, and most did, sooner or later. There was an old story his employees liked to tell about a meeting with an investor who had come from abroad, full of swagger and impatience. The man talked for nearly an hour, presenting slides and figures, trying to impress Youngie with grand projections. Youngie listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, his face unreadable. When the man finally paused and asked, "What do you think?" Youngie simply said, "You don't believe your own numbers." The silence that followed was heavier than any speech could have been. The deal never happened, but the story became legend. That was his way. He didn't argue. He saw. In private, his quietness was no less profound. He was not a man of many friends, but those who knew him well understood that his calm came from a deep internal discipline. He rose early, often before dawn, and walked alone before the city stirred. These walks were his form of meditation, a time to order thoughts without the interference of voices. He believed that the world was already too full of sound, too much talking, too much proving. "If you need to explain who you are," he once told an associate, "you've already lost your sense of it." His philosophy of silence extended even to conflict. When others lashed out, he remained still. It wasn't passivity, it was strategy. Noise feeds on reaction, and Youngie refused to be its sustenance. He had once said, almost in passing, "When someone throws dirt, let them. Dirt only stains if you bend to pick it up." Those words became something of a quiet creed among those who worked closest to him. To follow Youngie was to learn restraint, not the kind that suppresses emotion, but the kind that transforms it into focus. Of course, silence had its costs. There were those who mistook it for coldness, who longed for some sign of warmth beneath the still exterior. But those who earned his trust found that his quiet carried an unexpected compassion. He listened deeply. He remembered what people said and what they didn't. He noticed the tremor in a voice, the hesitation before a word. He never offered advice unless asked, but when he did, it came distilled, clear, unsentimental, true. His kindness was not in comfort, but in clarity. Years later, when Han's group had become a vast empire, its reach spanning industries, continents, and governments, Youngie remained unchanged. He still preferred the smallest office, still avoided interviews, still said little at meetings. Journalists called him the invisible chairman, an enigma whose absence of public persona only deepened his legend. Yet to him, there was no mystery. "Silence," he once said during a rare address to his executives, "is not the absence of action, it's the foundation of it. Only in quiet can you hear what must be done." There was a quiet dignity to that belief, a kind of ancient wisdom that had survived the modern appetite for noise, and perhaps that was why he never felt threatened by ignorance or insult. He understood that truth doesn't shout, it endures. A storm may be loud, but it always passes. The mountain it roars against remains unmoved. So when people wondered why Youngie never reacted, why he stood still while others scrambled for attention, they were asking the wrong question. It wasn't that he couldn't respond, it was that he saw no need to. Power to him wasn't about proving, it was about presence. And in a world addicted to noise, silence was the rarest, most commanding sound of all. The story of Hans Group did not begin with a grand announcement or a line of flashing cameras. It began quietly in the corner of a dim office in Busan, where a young man named Youngie Han stared at a ledger that held more dreams than numbers. He had no family fortune behind him, no mentors to guide his way. What he had was an uncanny sense of patterns, an instinct for timing, and a distaste for noise. In a world where success was shouted from rooftops, he preferred to build in whispers. Youngie was 23 when he started his first business, an import venture dealing with industrial parts that no one else seemed interested in. It wasn't glamorous, but he saw inefficiencies that others ignored. While competitors fought for visibility, he quietly perfected logistics, undercut prices, and built trust one shipment at a time. When asked about his goals, he would shrug and say, "To last." It wasn't ambition in the traditional sense. It was endurance disguised as modesty. He wanted something that could survive without him standing on a stage. By the time his peers were chasing venture capital, Youngie had already learned to despise it. He believed that real growth was slow, almost invisible at first. "If you need to tell people you're winning," he once told an early partner, "you probably aren't." He built networks through conversations over cheap meals, through handshakes with suppliers who appreciated his punctuality and precision. His leadership style was unconventional. He didn't demand loyalty, he earned it by listening more than he spoke. People found it disarming, even unsettling, to work for someone who didn't seem to crave recognition. When Hans Group was officially founded, it wasn't because Youngie had planned an empire. It was because the pieces he'd built, small logistics companies, parts suppliers, distribution networks, had naturally converged into a single organism. What had started as a series of practical solutions to daily problems had become a quietly sprawling conglomerate. It operated under different names for years before anyone realized they were all connected. By then, Youngie was already too far ahead to be traced easily. Reporters began to notice, but he never returned their calls. His decision to stay out of the public eye puzzled many. In an age where CEOs turned into celebrities and companies lived or died by their founders' personalities, he remained invisible. No interviews, no speeches, no social media. Even the employees of Hans Group rarely saw him. He worked from sparse offices with no personal photographs, no luxury decor, nothing that suggested ego. He was not shy, he was deliberate. "A shadow can move where the light cannot," he once said to a confidant. "The louder they speak, the less they hear." Under his leadership, Hans Group grew in ways that analysts struggled to explain. It diversified into shipping, manufacturing, energy, and technology without the chaos that usually followed such expansion. There was no grand vision statement, no glossy rebranding. Instead, each move seemed to anticipate shifts in the global market just before they happened. Competitors called it luck. Insiders called it foresight, but Youngie himself credited patience. He believed that information spoke most clearly when others stopped talking. The people closest to him noticed a strange paradox. For someone who avoided fame, Youngie had an almost theatrical sense of presence in private. When he spoke, his words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were rare. His silence wasn't indifference, it was observation. He could walk through a factory floor once and later recall the placement of every tool, the rhythm of each machine. He had an engineer's memory and a philosopher's restraint. Some employees called him the Ghost, not out of fear, but because his influence was felt everywhere, even when he wasn't seen. By the early 2000s, Han's Group had become one of South Korea's most profitable private entities. Still, no one could quite say what Youngie looked like. Photographs were scarce, and when one finally surfaced in a trade magazine, it was almost disappointing. An ordinary man in an unbranded suit, his face half turned away from the camera. The article speculated about his reclusiveness, comparing him to old-world tycoons who believed in anonymity as power. But for Youngie, invisibility wasn't strategy. It was freedom. He believed that attention corrupted judgment. "The moment people look at you," he once said, "they stop seeing what you're doing." Inside the company, his leadership style defied every corporate textbook. He discouraged titles, preferred teams to function autonomously, and once disbanded an entire executive board because he felt it had grown self-congratulatory. He didn't measure performance in numbers alone, but in consistency. If an employee's results fluctuated wildly, brilliant one quarter, poor the next, he would quietly move them aside. "Stability," he said, "is the true measure of intelligence." Many found his standards impossible, but those who endured became fiercely loyal. To them, Han's Group wasn't just a company. It was a philosophy of endurance in a world addicted to velocity. As global recognition grew, investors begged him to take the company public. The valuations were staggering. But he refused, each time with the same calm response. "If we sell pieces of ourselves, we lose the whole." Instead, he reinvested profits into research and infrastructure, often years before the market saw their value. When energy prices surged, Han's Group had already secured renewable sources. When the logistics industry digitized, his systems were already automated. He seemed to operate not in the present, but slightly ahead of it. And yet, despite his brilliance, there was a loneliness to his empire. Those who worked closest to him said he carried silence like a weight. He never married, never appeared in society pages, and his only known indulgence was classical music, played softly in the background of his rare meetings. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk through empty warehouses as if reminding himself that all empires, even quiet ones, were built by human hands. The world began to mythologize him. There were rumors of hidden heirs, secret projects, and even of philanthropic foundations he never attached his name to. The truth was simpler. Youngie had built exactly what he wanted, a system that could thrive without him. To him, that was the highest form of leadership. Not charisma, not applause, sustainability. When asked once in a rare moment of reflection whether he ever regretted staying invisible, he smiled faintly and said, "Visibility is overrated. History remembers results, not faces." It was the closest he ever came to explaining himself. And perhaps that was the essence of Han's Group, an empire that grew without spectacle, a monument to the power of silence in an age that worshipped noise. In time, people would call it the quiet empire, but to Youngie, it was never about quietness. It was about clarity. He had built a world where every decision spoke for itself, where the work was louder than the man. And when he finally stepped away, there were no headlines, no farewell announcements, only the soft hum of a machine that kept moving exactly as he intended. Lewis leaned back in his chair, the slow, smug tilt of a man who had mistaken silence for submission. The murmur of the cafe wrapped around them, clinking cups, low laughter, a hiss of steam from the espresso machine. But Lewis's voice cut through it all, louder now, fuller, as though the air itself were his audience. "You know," he began, swirling the untouched coffee in his cup, "when you're operating at my level, you stop thinking in terms of projects and start thinking in terms of systems. I don't just manage one branch anymore. I'm shaping the company's entire trajectory." His eyes glimmered with a self-satisfaction that bordered on performance. Youngie didn't flinch. Her stillness seemed to feed him, to invite more. "We've been working on something massive," he continued, leaning in as if sharing a secret that would shake the world. "The board's about to greenlight an expansion, Asia first, then Europe. It's been months of negotiation, strategy sessions, financial modeling, real leadership stuff." He smirked, watching her expression for cracks. "It's not something most people could keep up with. The stress alone, the sheer complexity of it. You have to have a certain kind of mind for that." The last words lingered in the air like the scent of burnt coffee, heavy, bitter. Youngie's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in that quiet way one might smile at a child describing his make-believe kingdom. Lewis took it as encouragement. "Of course, when you're dealing with a board," he said, his tone puffed with self-importance, "you have to understand politics. It's not just about numbers or operations. It's about perception, optics. People at your level don't really see that side of things." "At your level," he said it so casually, like a flick of lint from his tailored sleeve, yet it landed with a quiet precision. Youngie's gaze softened, drifting toward the window where the light played across the glass in fractured gold. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't need to. Lewis mistook her silence for awe. "You know, I remember when I was first starting out," he went on, his tone shifting into that grand, nostalgic register people adopt when narrating their own legend. "I had to fight for every inch. Nothing was handed to me. But I've learned how to command a room, how to read people, how to, well, make things happen. It's just not something you can teach." He paused for effect, waiting for acknowledgement. Youngie blinked once, slow and calm, the way one might mark a beat in music. Lewis leaned back again, smiling. "I suppose you've never had to deal with that kind of responsibility. The weight of decision-making, the accountability that comes when millions are on the line. It's different." There was a glimmer of condescension in his eyes, a faint amusement at her supposed simplicity. He had built an image of her, quiet, observant, perhaps talented but small in the grand scheme of his imagined empire. But silence, real silence, is never empty. It listens, it learns. And in that moment, Youngie's silence was the only thing in the room that held its shape. Lewis's voice kept spilling forward, buoyed by the sound of itself. "You see, the board values people who can think strategically, not just execute tasks. They rely on people like me to drive direction. You can't expect everyone to understand what that's like, of course. Some people just stay where they are. And that's fine. We need good people everywhere." He said it kindly, as though offering charity. For a moment, she looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her eyes unsettled him. It wasn't challenge. It wasn't anger. It was the faintest trace of pity. Lewis cleared his throat. "Anyway, once the expansion goes through, I'll be heading to Singapore for a few months. Meetings, negotiations, the kind of thing that keeps me busy." "You must be very tired," she said softly. The words were simple, almost gentle, but something in them cracked the surface of his performance. He chuckled, perhaps a second too late. "It comes with the territory. You get used to it." Her gaze lingered, unblinking. And yet you talk about it so much. The pause stretched between them, fragile as a breath. Louis shifted slightly, his confidence faltering just long enough to reveal the edge of strain beneath. Then, recovering, he smiled again, a little too brightly. Well, I suppose when you're passionate about your work, it's hard not to share. You'd understand that, if you ever get to that level. That level. He said it again, as if the phrase itself confirmed a hierarchy that only he could see. Youngi's fingers brushed the rim of her cup, tracing the faint circle of condensation. Levels, she murmured, almost to herself. It's funny how people like to measure things that can't be measured. Louis frowned slightly. What do you mean? Responsibility, worth, understanding. You talk as if they're numbers in a spreadsheet. Her tone was quiet. But each word was deliberate. But some things don't scale the way you think they do. He blinked, unsure whether she was questioning him or simply musing aloud. Either way, it unsettled him. He laughed it off, reaching for his coffee. Maybe, but trust me, when you've been in my position, you see the world differently. You stop worrying about the little things. Youngi tilted her head. Or maybe you stop seeing the small things that matter. The hum of the cafe swelled back into focus, the steady clatter of dishes, the low thread of conversation. The space between them grew quieter, heavier. Louis forced another smile, but his words had begun to lose their rhythm. The performance faltered. Anyway, I didn't mean to bore you with all that corporate talk. You didn't, she said. You told me exactly what I needed to know. He laughed. Uncertain, but she didn't return it. Her stillness felt less like silence now and more like something that had outlasted noise. Louis looked away first. The reflection in the window caught him, his face superimposed over the city behind him, sharp suit, rehearsed smile, the gleam of someone trying to look like he belonged to something vast. For a fleeting second, he wondered if she saw through it all. Youngi rose, smoothing her coat with unhurried grace. Enjoy your expansion, she said, her voice soft but edged with something unreadable. I hope it takes you exactly where you think you're going. And before he could reply, she was gone, leaving behind the faint trace of calm, the echo of her words, and the uncomfortable realization that perhaps, just perhaps, his empire sounded smaller when spoken aloud. The lights dimmed, and a low hum of anticipation rippled through the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast soft prisms across the tables, where guests leaned closer, their chatter fading into the velvet hush of expectancy. The MC stood at the podium, smile polished, voice steady, though the faintest tremor betrayed the weight of what was about to unfold. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, the microphone catching the edge of his breath. Thank you for being part of this remarkable evening. We are honored tonight to welcome a visionary, a leader whose name has shaped the very skyline of our cities. Please join me in celebrating our keynote speaker, the founder and CEO of Han's Group, Mr. Youngi Han. For a moment, the name hung in the air like a struck chord, resonating through disbelief before recognition broke over the crowd. A pause. Then an eruption of applause so fierce it seemed to shake the floor. Chairs scraped, cameras lifted. Somewhere, a champagne glass shattered. The spotlight swung sharply across the room, catching a figure at one of the back tables. Youngi rose slowly, calm amid the chaos, his tailored suit gleaming faintly in the white glow. Louis turned his head toward the stage, confusion knotting his features. He blinked, almost laughed as though waiting for the punchline. But then the crowd parted just enough, and the beam of light framed Youngi's face. Serene, unflinching, unmistakable. The sound around him seemed to distort, clapping hands and voices warping into a dull roar. His smirk faltered. Color drained from his face. Every arrogant word he'd thrown across that table earlier in the evening seemed to echo back at him, merciless and raw. Youngie didn't rush. He buttoned his jacket, the gesture precise, deliberate. As he made his way toward the stage, the applause rose to a fevered pitch, and flashes from cameras cut through the air like lightning. People leaned forward, whispering, some smiling in awe, others gaping in disbelief. The legendary founder of Hans Group, known for his reclusive nature, for declining interviews, for rarely appearing in public, was standing right here, walking past them as though time itself had paused to make room. Louis stood rigid, his fingers tightening around the edge of the tablecloth until the fabric strained. He wanted to move, to speak, to do something, but there was nothing left to do. Every ounce of superiority he'd displayed earlier had turned to dust. The man he'd mocked, dismissed as a minor player, was the architect of the empire he had desperately been trying to impress. Youngie reached the podium. He inclined his head slightly toward the MC, then to the crowd, his expression composed, almost gentle. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying with effortless authority. The applause softened into a reverent hush. "It's an honor to be here tonight, among so many who share a vision for progress and possibility. This company began with little more than an idea that people could build something greater together if they learned to look past appearances and see potential for what it truly is." The words landed with quiet precision. They weren't grandiose, nor were they vindictive, but there was weight in them, weight that found Louis like a blade pressed to the chest. The air around him felt suddenly thinner, the room hotter. He saw, in that instant, the absurdity of his arrogance, the smallness of his gestures, the fragility of the mask he had worn for so long. Every laugh, every boast, every sneer now mocked only him. Youngie continued, his tone warm but grounded, the cadence of someone who had built his life on clarity rather than performance. "We measure success in numbers and buildings, but what truly sustains it is understanding, the ability to recognize worth before the world does. Tonight isn't about me. It's about what can be built when people believe in something more than ego." Applause broke again, not the polite kind that follows every speech, but something deeper, admiration, respect, awe. Cameras caught every angle, journalists scribbled, and the hum of renewed energy filled the ballroom like the slow swell of a symphony. Youngie's presence seemed to expand beyond the stage, filling every corner of the room. Louis sat frozen, his mind grasping at fragments, deals, dinners, names, the way he'd brushed off the quiet man in the corner, the way he'd smirked at the suggestion of collaboration. It replayed in cruel clarity. Around him, people were already rising, craning for a better view, some whispering to each other in excitement. "That's him! That's really him!" And then, as if fate wanted to twist the knife just once more, Youngie's gaze drifted toward him. It wasn't a glare or even a smile, just a calm acknowledgement, a fleeting look that saw straight through the layers of pretense. For Louis, it was unbearable. His stomach turned. He looked away, pretending to check his phone, to sip his drink, to do anything that might make him invisible. When Youngie finished, the standing ovation was immediate. The crowd rose as one, clapping, cheering, the sound almost deafening. The MC returned to the stage, shaking Youngie's hand with both of his, grinning so widely it seemed his face might split. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Han," he proclaimed, as if announcing a king. The cameras kept flashing. People surged forward to greet him, to shake his hand, to offer praise they'd never dared give in person before. Youngie accepted it all with quiet composure, answering each with a nod, a few words, a smile that didn't quite give away what he was thinking. Louis remained seated. The applause still thundered, but it no longer reached him. He sat in the aftershock, watching as the man he'd underestimated became the center of the world he had tried so desperately to conquer. The proof was undeniable now, the hierarchy inverted, his illusions shattered. As the crowd encircled Youngie, Lewis's reflection caught in the side of his wine glass, pale, drawn, unrecognizable. He forced a hollow laugh, a desperate attempt to shake it off, but the sound of it died in his throat. No one was looking at him anymore. He had become background noise, swallowed by the celebration. Up on stage, Youngie turned slightly, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Not cruel, but knowing. A look that seemed to say everything words could not. That power had never needed to announce itself. It simply waited for the right moment to be seen. The applause went on. The light followed him as he stepped down from the stage, moving through the crowd like a current cutting through water. Every person he passed leaned in, eager to speak, to be seen, to align themselves with the force of his presence. And through it all, Youngie's calm never faltered. Lewis, still at his table, finally exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The room sparkled around him, brilliant and cold. The world, once so neatly ordered in his mind, had shifted beyond recognition. The man he'd dismissed now stood at the center of everything, and he, once loud, once certain, was nothing more than the echo of his own undoing. The air still hummed with the static of applause when Youngie stepped forward. The crowd's energy lingered, restless and expectant, like the last tremor after thunder. He looked out at the faces, some still bright with admiration, others calculating, a few skeptical, and for a moment, he let the silence stretch. It was a silence he had earned, one that did not demand to be filled. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no strain, no effort to sound grand. It was steady, almost conversational, as if he were simply continuing a thought he'd begun long ago. He spoke about leadership, but not the kind carved into stone plaques or shouted over podiums. He spoke of it the way one might speak of craftsmanship or tending a garden, quiet work, slow and deliberate, mostly invisible. "There's a temptation," he said, "to think that power must be proven, that it lives in titles, applause, or the weight of other people's opinions. But those things fade faster than they arrive. The truth is simpler. Real power isn't something you perform. It's something you practice every day, especially when no one's watching." The room softened around his words. A few leaned forward. Others lowered their phones, sensing that this wasn't a speech to capture, but one to remember. He went on, speaking not as a man closing a chapter, but as someone who had quietly made peace with his own contradictions. "Leadership without ego isn't about pretending not to care," he continued. "It's about caring differently. You stop asking what you can take from the moment, and start asking what the moment requires of you. That's where meaning lives. Not in what people say about you, but in what remains standing when you're gone." There was a murmur of approval, soft but genuine. He didn't acknowledge it. Praise, like criticism, was simply weather passing over the same landscape. Youngie's eyes moved over the crowd, catching fragments of memory in their expressions, faces that once doubted him, others that had quietly believed. He had learned over time that neither mattered much. Belief was never a currency worth chasing. The work was what endured. He took a small breath, and for the briefest moment, the corners of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, more a trace of amusement at the world's persistent need to label strength. "People think being underestimated is a disadvantage," he said. "It isn't. It's freedom. When no one expects you to matter, you can do what truly matters. You can build without noise, lead without spectacle, and let the results speak long after you've left the room." The crowd was utterly still now. He wasn't trying to charm them, and that was precisely why they listened. His words carried none of the self-conscious polish of a man defending his legacy. Instead, they carried the clarity of someone who had already stopped measuring his worth by what others could see. He let his gaze wander again, past the front rows of dignitaries and journalists, to the quieter corners of the hall where the younger faces stood, those still hungry, still unscarred by ambition. It was to them he spoke next, though he never singled them out. "You'll learn," he said, "that every insult doesn't deserve an answer, and every challenge doesn't need a response. There's strength in restraint, but it's the kind of strength few will praise you for. They'll call it indifference, or weakness, or arrogance. Let them. You'll know better. Power that has to prove itself isn't power. It's insecurity dressed in armor." He paused, letting the words land where they needed to. The truth had a way of finding its own audience. Outside, through the high glass panes, the late afternoon light was beginning to fade into gold. The day was closing the same way it began, quietly, without announcement. Youngie felt the symmetry of it, the calm satisfaction of knowing he no longer had to win anyone over. He wasn't speaking for applause, or legacy, or even remembrance. He was speaking because it was time to say something honest. "Build something that will outlast your name," he said softly. "That's the only kind of reputation worth having, the kind that doesn't belong to you anymore." A few people nodded. Others just watched, silent, thoughtful. He could see the questions forming behind their eyes, about ambition, about sacrifice, about how one learns to let go of being seen. But those were questions no speech could answer. They had to be lived, stumbled through, paid for. He thought briefly of all the noise that used to matter, the whispers of competition, the endless posturing, the small wars fought in boardrooms and headlines. None of it carried weight anymore. He had come to understand that the most decisive victories often left no mark on the surface. They lived in moments like this, in composure, in clarity, in the refusal to be dragged down to the level of noise. He took another breath, slower now. The applause that had followed him up to the stage was long gone, replaced by an attentive stillness. Somewhere near the back, a door creaked open. Someone slipped out quietly, perhaps thinking the speech was over. Youngie didn't mind. Those who needed to hear him were still here. "Authority," he said finally, "isn't about volume. It's about presence. The right kind doesn't need to shout, because it already fills the room." He let the words hang there, neither rushed nor forced, and for the first time that evening, he smiled. A real one this time, faint and knowing. There was nothing left to prove, no correction to make, no name to defend. He had said what he came to say. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, the kind that doesn't need applause to be complete. Then, as if on cue, the crowd rose, not with a roar, but with the kind of applause that builds slowly, like something earned rather than demanded. Youngie nodded once, almost a bow, and stepped back from the podium. The light caught his face for a brief moment before he turned and walked off stage. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The weight of real power wasn't in the hands that reached for him or the eyes that followed, but in the quiet certainty of his stride, steady, unhurried, already moving toward what came next. And in that silence, as the applause began to fade, what lingered wasn't his name, or his speech, or even his image under the lights. What lingered was a lesson, simple and enduring, that true authority asks for nothing, announces nothing, and proves nothing. It simply is. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. And if Youngie's words cut deep into your heart, I want you to sit with it for a second. The weight of real power, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't beg to be seen, but changes everything quietly. If that message hit something inside you, don't just let it drift away. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to stay with you. Like this video if you believe real strength doesn't need noise. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to know where this message is reaching. See you in the next one.